All right, for more on the investigation, I want to bring in CBSN security analyst and former FBI Assistant Director Ron Hosko, who is in Washington. Ron, as investigators try and determine a motive, we now know that the suspect's mother-in-law attended this church, and officials say there was some kind of a domestic situation going on with this family. What does that tell you when you look at this shooting?
You know, Vlad, it's going to be, I think, very telling what were the frequency of his posts, his texts, his contacts that related to his in-laws, specifically his mother-in-law. What did that relationship look like over time, and what did it look like in the last few days and weeks? Was there an increased focus on that? Were the texts and the conversations or the communications becoming more and more aggressive, more and more violent, more and more threatening? But it certainly seems like here we are just 12 hours or 24 hours after this horrific event. And it certainly seems like law enforcement, has a strong scent that's taking them in a very specific direction.
And Ryan, as you know, CBS News has learned that the suspect received what's known as a bad conduct discharge after allegedly assaulting his wife and child in 2012. This was a discharge from the United States Air Force. This attack targeted so many young children. Do you, as a former assistant director of the FBI, see a pattern of aggression here?
Well, it certainly suggests that to this offender, abuse of children, and in this case now horrific violence against children, was not off the table. To most Americans, the notion of child abuse in any form is horrifying, and we have our boundaries. You may get in a fight with another adult, you may trade blows with another adult, or exchange nasty words with another adult, but kids are out of the conversation. It doesn't seem like that was the case with this attacker, based on his past and based on what happened yesterday. So, whether he was abused as a child himself, had serious emotional issues as a child himself. One of the things that I'm kind of looking at in what's coming out is the sense that he was more or less socially isolated, almost had to pay for friends. And that is a common factor with a lot of active shooters. Look no further than Las Vegas just weeks ago, and you see another person who was increasingly isolated from the world around him. That is one of those things that I think is in the background of a lot of active shooters.
And Ron, so there are a couple of things here that, as you know, typically happen in the wake of these mass shootings, right? The politicians and everybody starts asking questions about gun control, and some suggest that it has to do less with gun control and more to do with mental health issues. We're not politicians. You're a former law enforcement officer. But I want to ask, the fact that this sounds, according to the preliminary investigation, that this was a domestic situation, sounds like he was maybe angry or upset or frustrated or disappointed or whatever you want to say about certain situations in his life with his family, but that he did not own or have a license to own these weapons. Doesn't sound to me like mental health here. It sounds like access to weapons when he shouldn't have had them.
Well, it does sound like that. So that's in part the work that the ATF and the FBI will be doing now. Where did he get the weapons? Under what circumstances did he get the weapons? Should he have been a prohibited possessor and he went around the traditional system, which involves an FBI automatic or very fast background check that would have said, no, he's a prohibited possessor, he can't have this weapon? Did he find another source, which is easy to do in our world? You could go do a private sale, and if the person selling to you is not asking any questions at all other than do you have the money, it's easy to get a weapon. But I think it's more complicated than that, and I think we ought to be looking at a couple things. One is certainly his ability to obtain these weapons, every one of them. How easy, how hard, should it have been harder? Secondly, as we mentioned yesterday, the Fort Hood active shooter incident with Nidal Hasan, 8 years ago to the day yesterday, did the military have the right information on Nidal Hasan's psychological history, on his online history, what he was doing, and was it shared with other components of law enforcement, the FBI? Did that happen here? Should it have been more robust, a more robust exchange of information? And so that bad conduct discharge maybe should have been a prohibitor. How are those records exchanged? And then behind all of that, there is this mental health piece that's being reported now with friends and former schoolmates saying he was heavily medicated from 6th to 9th grade. He took a lot of psych drugs. So what did the military know? Did they do everything they should have and could have? Did they exchange that with other folks? And I think that's a huge gap in the gun procurement piece of America today. Are these folks who should not touch a weapon, should not possess a weapon, and they're able to get it? Whether they've diagnosed mentally ill, seriously mentally ill, it's in a record somewhere, and there's no connectivity to the FBI system. That's a problem. We ought to fix it.
Yeah, and Ron, real quick before I let you go, there's one more component that I thought of, which is, you know, we've heard from our politicians, our leaders, law enforcement officials who say one of the ways to try and prevent these things is to, you know, if you see something, say something. If something looks out of the ordinary, say something. The stuff that I've seen online is he had weapons on his Facebook page. He talked about owning weapons. Clearly, I'm assuming that there would be some people who would know that he's perhaps not licensed to have those weapons, but nobody said anything as far as we know now.
As far as we know now, and that is, I think according to the FBI studies, you know, 80–90% of the time, there are these pre-event indicators that you're referring to. And if those around him, somebody who knows what this person is about, sees that contextually inappropriate change or increasingly focused on weapon or ammunition procurement or building IEDs, those are all those indicators that somebody close to him ought to have seen and perhaps ought to have called.
Yeah, it's something that I learned when I was covering the Las Vegas massacre, Ron, which is, I didn't know this, that a very high percentage of these mass shooters actually, not only do they give signs, they actually tell people, and something like 40% of those people actually never report it. So that was a real fascinating statistic that I learned in covering this tragedy that happens all too often here. Ron Hosko, as always, my friend, thank you very much for your analysis. We appreciate it.
Sure.